The first thing to say is you can't measure serotonin levels or activity in the brain directly in human beings. The idea that depression is caused by low levels of serotonin is a theory. And that is what the public have come to believe, that there is no question about it. It had been demonstrated, they thought. And that simply was not the case. We don't have to make that assumption. And it's not how we used to understand depression. I think people still, underneath, have that understanding that actually depression is something that is a meaningful reaction to negative life events. But it's been suppressed to some extent. If what we are interpreting as improvement is sedation or emotional numbing, then we're not really looking at real improvement.
Welcome to the Visionary podcast, where we discuss science, medicine, physical health, and mental well-being. Professor Joanna Moncrieff, your new book, Chemically Imbalanced, The Making and Unmaking of the Serotonin Myth, challenges some of psychiatry's most deeply held assumptions. It sent shockwaves through psychiatry and beyond, unsettling certainties and exposing how fragile some of our trusted narratives really are. In the book, you trace a history of antidepressants from the 1960s through the 1990s, when it took hold in popular culture. I could detect some key moments here: early chemical imbalance theories in the 1960s, then the Prozac era. Prozac is an antidepressant. Advertising in the 1990s. What is the story we were told about serotonin's role in depression?
So thank you for having me on your podcast,
Pleasure.
Hala. Just to start with why I wrote the book, I wrote it because the public have been fundamentally misinformed about the nature of depression and about what we know about its associations with brain chemical processes. So there's been this story around for a long time that depression is caused by a lack of serotonin in the brain or some sort of abnormality of the serotonin system. Whereas, in fact, there is very little and certainly not a compelling or convincing evidence base for this idea. And yet millions of people have decided to take antidepressants because they were told that links between serotonin and depression were an established fact, or they were led to believe that in one way or another. So I wanted to tell people that these links are not an established fact. We do not know whether there is any connection between serotonin and depression, so that people can make more informed choices about whether to take antidepressants or not, how to understand the nature of their emotional feelings, and how to manage them.
But doesn't serotonin make me happy? This is the general understanding, right? If I have enough or healthy levels of serotonin in my brain, I'm bouncy and happy, right?
Yeah. So unfortunately, there is so much misinformation about all brain chemicals, including serotonin, and an impression is created that we know much more about them than we actually do. If you dig into the research on serotonin, you have to conclude that we are really uncertain about what on earth it does, other than it probably has some role in sexual functioning. It probably inhibits and impairs sexual functioning. Other than that, we're really uncertain. There is serotonin all over the brain, although there's more serotonin in our gut and in our blood cells, in fact. But the serotonin all over the brain, it's bound to be involved in everything that we do and think and feel for that reason. But we don't know what its specific functions are, other than this role in impairing and inhibiting sexual functioning.
Oh, so serotonin itself inhibits sexual function.
That seems to be the case. If you give people drugs that stimulate the serotonin system in some way, including, of course, the SSRI antidepressants, that's selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor antidepressants, it impairs people's sexual functioning. It reduces people's sexual desire, it reduces genital sensitivity, and it can cause, problems with getting an erection, having an orgasm, that sort of thing. And so there seems to be evidence that increasing serotonin or stimulating the serotonin system in some way has a negative impact on sexual functioning. but so people have also suggested that serotonin is involved in appetite, in sleep, in cognitive functions, as well as, of course, in mood.
Yeah.
But the evidence for any of those areas is really inconsistent, and we can't draw any conclusions about what specific role, if any, serotonin has in them.
Yeah, I would assume that if I take a drug, it must be based on evidence. So, but there is a popular imagination of depression as a brain illness. Now, can we talk about the assumed evidence that led to the use of antidepressants? Okay, what does the medical community rely on in using that proposition that, okay, you have low serotonin in your brain, and this drug fixes that, you no longer have depression? What is the evidence?
So thank you for asking me, because I think it's important to set out. I've just said there isn't much evidence for there being any links between serotonin and mood, as well as all those other areas of functioning that we talked about. But I think because people have been told for such a long time that a lack of serotonin causes depression, that serotonin has an important causal role in depression, it's important to really set out the evidence for that. And that's why I got a team together to look at all that evidence, to get all the modern evidence on serotonin and depression together. And we published a systematic review covering that evidence in 2022. So we got evidence. There are a number of different ways that people have looked at the activity of serotonin and its links with depression. The first thing to say is you can't measure serotonin levels or activity in the brain directly in human beings. It would be too invasive and dangerous. So that's not been done. So all the ways that people have tried to gauge the activity of serotonin are indirect in one way or another. People have looked, for example, at the levels of one of the serotonin breakdown products in the cerebrospinal fluid. That's
Breakdown
the fluid
products.
that, yes, so serotonin itself is broken down very quickly. So to get an impression of serotonin concentrations, it's better in some ways to look at the breakdown products of serotonin. So that's why that's been looked at. And that's been looked at in the levels in the fluid that surrounds the brain and the spinal cord, which you can look at by doing a lumbar puncture.
So is this a direct correlation between having serotonin in the brain and the other chemicals in the brain? Is this reliable relation?
So we're not sure, but the levels in the cerebrospinal fluid are probably as direct as we get.
Okay.
Yeah, they're probably as close to the levels of serotonin in the brain as we can get. And those studies, they don't involve large numbers of people, but there are several hundred who've entered these studies and had lumbar punctures. And those studies do not show any link between serotonin and depression. They do not show that people who've been diagnosed with depression have lower levels of the serotonin metabolite in their cerebrospinal fluid.
Hi, I'm Hala, your host today. If you're enjoying what you see, please hit that lovely subscribe button. It will mean a lot to us. Or maybe a small podcast now, but with your support, we can build this channel together, one step at a time. Thank you so much for being part of it. And when doctors say you have low serotonin in your brain, low compared to what? Is there a baseline for it?
So they're comparing people with depression and people without depression. So there's an assumption that if you take a random sample of people who don't have depression, they will show normal, in quote, levels of serotonin in their brains. Okay, so before prescribing antidepressants, would my GP or psychiatrist be able to check whether do they do a lab test or any biomarker to check whether I'm actually low in serotonin or not? So doctors do not do that. No. And if they did do that, to measure serotonin directly, they'd have to drill into your brain. But even if they did a lumbar puncture and indirectly, maybe, or they could measure serotonin levels in your blood. But even if they did do that, they would not be detecting. So there is no way they would not be detecting depression because we haven't shown those links between serotonin and depression. So I was talking about how we've got studies that have measured the levels of the serotonin metabolite in the cerebrospinal fluid. There are also some studies that have measured levels of serotonin in the blood, and they also do not show a link between serotonin and depression. There are studies that have looked at the serotonin receptors. Those are little proteins on the surface of the nerve cells in the brain that are triggered by serotonin and that transmit the serotonin impulse. And those, the studies on those also do not show consistent evidence of any abnormality in people with depression compared to people without depression. People have also looked at something called the serotonin transporter protein, which is a protein that is in the what we call the synapse. That's the gap between the nerve cells, so serotonin is what we call a neurotransmitter. It's a chemical that transmits an electrical impulse from one nerve cell to another across this gap called the synapse. Now, there is a protein in the synapse, which we call the serotonin transporter protein, which removes serotonin from the synapse. So effectively, it deactivates serotonin. And it's that protein, in fact, that the SSRI antidepressants work on. They inhibit that. And therefore, the theory is that they will increase the concentrations of serotonin that remain in that gap between the nerve cells where it has its action. So that thereby they will, by doing that, they will increase the activity of serotonin. So there have been some studies looking at whether there are abnormalities of the serotonin transporter in people with depression compared to people without depression. Again, the findings are highly inconsistent. Some find there might be lower levels of that transporter protein. Some find there might be higher levels. Some find no difference.
So the medical community, sorry to interrupt, just for me to wrap my head around this, the medical community is prescribing antidepressants that supposedly increase serotonin in my brain, even though it hasn't been proven that I lack serotonin in the first place.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And this is the really important thing for people to know. The idea that depression is caused by low levels of serotonin is a theory. It was a theory that was proposed back in the 1960s, massively promoted by the pharmaceutical industry in the 1990s, but it remains a theory. It has not been demonstrated to be true. The research that has been done to look at whether there are links between serotonin and depression has not convincingly shown that those links exist.
Inference, let's say, it's an inference or
an idea, a speculation, a possibility.
Okay. Well, when I do take antidepressant drugs, do you agree that serotonin levels in my brain will increase, whether this is beneficial or not?
So I'm afraid that we also don't know very clearly what antidepressants do to the brain either. They certainly do something to the brain. They are chemicals that cross the blood-brain barrier, so they're going to change our normal brain chemistry by their presence. And there's some evidence that the SSRI antidepressants, because they inhibit that serotonin transporter, increase the activity of serotonin in the very short term. But actually, there's also some evidence that in the long term, taking SSRI antidepressants reduces serotonin. There are a few studies that show that the serotonin levels in the blood of people taking antidepressants are lower than serotonin levels of people not taking antidepressants, regardless of whether or not they have depression.
Yeah. And this was measured indirectly, as you told us.
So this is a measure of serotonin in the blood, not in the brain.
Yes.
So it's indirect in that sense. And these are people who've mostly taken antidepressants for fairly long periods of time. So what that suggests as a possibility is that SSRI type antidepressants increase the activity of serotonin initially, but then might reduce it.
Because it's a hormone.
Well, because the brain adapts to the presence of the drug, and the brain can often it's trying to neutralize the effects of the drug, the brain, but sometimes it can overshoot. Exactly. But on the other hand, as I said, one of the most consistently shown effects of boosting the serotonin system is sexual dysfunction. We know that SSRI antidepressants cause sexual dysfunction in people while they're taking them, and that sexual dysfunction doesn't generally just go away after a few days. It's an effect that persists, and it can in fact even persist after people stop taking the drug. So that suggests that the serotonin system has been ramped up in some way. The basic message is the picture is confused. We don't fully understand what SSRIs do to the brain at all. I think we need to we need to pay more attention to the effects that these drugs actually induce in people, because that's what we can actually observe and measure and record. As I say, they're drugs that are changing the nature of our brain chemistry and activity, and therefore inevitably they do change our mental activity and our behaviour and our functioning in different ways. One of the consistent effects that antidepressants, particularly SSRI type antidepressants, have is they numb people's emotions. So people describe maybe not feeling so intensely sad anymore, but also not being able to feel happiness or excitement or surprise any longer. And that effect may also be associated with their effect on sexual functioning. They're just sort of dialing down our sensitivity, our sexual and emotional sensitivity.
It dulls the negative feelings and the positive feelings.
Yeah.
So I can't be happy. I'm emotionally dull or suppressed in a way.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just to say, this effect is very consistently reported by people who take these drugs. There's lots of literature about people describing these effects, and it's an effect that people describe to me in my clinical practice very frequently.
Can some people welcome that effect? Like, instead of being severely anxious and struggling with debilitating emotional pain, some people would rather not feel anything?
I think that's probably right. I think probably some people do welcome that effect, and and some people describe how they feel it's been helpful for them, at least temporarily. On the other hand, I would say that my impression is the majority of people actually find that effect quite unpleasant. It's a very common,
the long term.
And it's a very common reason for people stopping antidepressants.
Yeah, but it might be, from what I read online for the research of this episode, it might be why some patients find relief in these antidepressants. Like, some viewers might say, oh, antidepressant saved my cousin's life, it made me feel better. Temporarily, it's a side effect of the drug, and the drug doesn't actually fix some spontaneous biological defect in the brain.
So I agree with you. I think in theory, if you numb someone's emotions, that might be helpful, or it might be perceived as being helpful. The trouble is, and we'll maybe get into this in a minute, the evidence that antidepressants are actually helpful to people, are actually beneficial in terms of reducing feelings of depression and other problems that people have associated with those, is very slim. And I would say that actually that all those studies don't really show that antidepressants have any positive effects.
We established the fact that low serotonin in the brain doesn't cause depression, but is low serotonin in the brain a medical condition, or just a variation between a brain and another brain? If I have low serotonin in the brain, would that cause any harm physiologically?
So I think we just don't know. I mean, presumably there's variation between people in terms of their levels of serotonin. As I say, we don't really understand what serotonin is doing. We don't understand its specific functions. So I think it's very difficult for us to say whether, in theory, having low serotonin would be harmful or not. But there must be a normal range for it, as there is for for all our brain chemicals and all our other bodily functions.
Do we know yet of any proven scientific biological cause of depression?
No, we don't. There are no proven biological causes. I think that's a very important thing to say, because along with the idea that low serotonin might be a cause of depression, numerous other biological mechanisms have been proposed. There are many other theories about possible biological mechanisms, such as, for example, there's been an idea over the last few years that depression might be caused by an abnormality of the inflammatory system. Abnormalities in something called neural plasticity, that's the ability of nerve cells to branch and make new connections, has also recently been proposed as a mechanism for depression. None of these things have been established as causes of depression either. And in fact, the evidence base for all these other theories is very much less than the evidence base on serotonin and depression, where there's, because of the antidepressants and the drug companies, there's been a lot of research into possible connections.
Yes, that's very interesting because what I understand now that you're telling us that the medical argument boils down to we haven't found a cause of depression, but it must be there. So we are assuming it's there. And there are a number of routes to try hard to find a biological cause of depression, but maybe there isn't.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because that absolutely nails it. There is an assumption within the medical community, or at least within sort of mainstream psychiatric community, that there is a biological cause of depression. And if it's not serotonin, it just must be something else, and we just haven't found it yet. We don't have to make that assumption. And it's not how we used to understand depression. If you go back to the 1980s, people understood depression as an emotional reaction to negative things happening in your life, as an understandable emotional state, something that was that had meaning, that happened for a reason. People might not always have been aware what the reason was, but it was something that could eventually be made meaningful.
Yes.
And so if you asked someone in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, what is the cause of depression? They would say unemployment, divorce, child abuse.
Trauma.
Lack
of meaning.
Bad things happening in your life, or yes, a lack of purpose and meaning. If you ask people now, they might well tell you that it's due to your brain chemicals or something happening in the brain because of the success of the promotional campaigns by the pharmaceutical industry to change people's mindset and convince people that depression is a medical problem. I think people still underneath have that understanding that actually depression is something that is a meaningful reaction to negative life events. But it's been suppressed to some extent by this medical framework that's been imposed from the outside.
Being masked, because publicity and marketing are very powerful things. And if the NHS, we'll talk about the NHS obviously, and the medical community, if your GP, you trust your GP, you go there for help. And if you refer to psychiatrists, that's even like second command, like it's not front care, that's even more specialized. You trust whatever you hear from them. They are in a place of medical authority. Why would I discredit anything a doctor tells me?
And this is why it's so important, I feel, to get across to people that the link between serotonin and depression has not been established, because in order to persuade people to reject their underlying understanding of depression as a meaningful emotional reaction, they had to be led to believe that a biological mechanism had been convincingly identified, that it had been established, that it had been proven, that there was no question about it.
That's science.
And that is what the public have come to believe, that there is no question about it. It had been demonstrated, they thought. And that simply was not the case. And people should not have been misled in that way. People should have been informed that this remained at the level of a theory, and no one had demonstrated these links convincingly.
So why do you think psychiatrists hold on to that idea of biological mechanism to depression for such a long time without evidence? Surely they are way well informed and better researchers than patients like myself. Why do you think?
So that's a complicated question, and it requires delving into the history of the psychiatric profession. But just to sort of summarize it briefly, depression is a very common state of mind, and it probably makes up the vast majority of problems that are presented to psychiatrists. And so I think they feel if they didn't have a medical framework for this problem, then their reason for existence, the bulk of the work that they currently do would fade away, would disappear.
Yes.
And psychiatrists who started life as the doctors who ran the old asylums, the old mental asylums, have been trying to get away from the stigmatized status that those asylums acquired for a long time. And one of the ways that they've tried to get away from that is by cultivating an outpatient practice among people who have more everyday emotional ups and downs, rather than the sort of severe mental health problems that we might call schizophrenia or bipolar disorder nowadays.
Yeah, but the phrase chemically imbalanced might be debunked, but some viewers might still be wondering, why does it work for some people? Is it like we talked about the side effect or temporary relief? Is this like, how can we reconcile the individual experiences with the lukewarm data?
Yeah. So that's a really important point. And so I spoke earlier briefly about all the studies that have been done on antidepressants and how they don't show very convincing beneficial effects. Those studies consist of placebo-controlled trials. So they compare an antidepressant with a dummy tablet, a pill that's made of sugar or chalk or something biologically inert. Those studies show that people who take a placebo tablet get better. The majority of them get quite a lot better. People who take the antidepressant get a tiny bit more better when you're measuring symptoms using a very artificial depression rating scale. But the difference is very small. So the important point to make is that people who are depressed get better anyway, and giving them something that they think is going to work, giving them a pill, even if it's completely inactive, gives them hope and will help them to get better faster.
So people get better just because they expect to get better? So they feel hopeful that things will improve?
Yes. So the act of giving people a pill improves people's, makes people think, oh, at last I've got a solution. I think also it's important to say people often go to the doctor at a really low point. And, often people haven't wanted to go to the doctor. It's, they didn't want to. They wanted to try and sort things out on their own, and that makes them feel,
Yes.
like a real failure. They go to the doctor says, take this pill. The patient experiences a feeling of relief. At last, now I've got an answer. It's not, it's not just that I couldn't manage to pull myself up. There's a medicine that's going to do it for me. And so that will produce feelings of relief, which I think, alleviate feelings of depression temporarily at least. But also often at that point, other things kick in. People admit to their, loved ones that they've been in a really bad place, and people,
Yes.
People rally round.
They find the support, the social support.
Yes,
they
exactly.
need.
So they find social support. They might at that point start to think, oh, I've really got to do something about this job that I hate and that's really been getting me down. Or maybe I need to, we need to go and get some relationship counselling, if that's a relationship problem has been part of the problem. So often at the point that people go to a doctor, other things are happening that are going to improve people's mood, as well as the hope that people get by being given a pill that they're told, will at least have some beneficial impact on them.
What kind of psychoactive effect do antidepressants have on my brain? We talked about sexual function, but how does this mechanism work that I feel emotionally dull or numbed or detached? What physiologically, what's happening in my brain?
We don't know. We don't know the answer to that. Because increasing serotonin activity is bad for your sexual functioning and probably is playing some role in this reduction of sexual sensitivity and desire. I think we can speculate that maybe, increasing serotonin activity is what's responsible for emotional numbing, but we just don't know. And all these drugs are not that specific. Even the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors are affecting other brain chemicals in various ways, not least because serotonin interacts with most of the other chemicals in our brain anyway. So if you are adjusting the serotonin activity, you're actually affecting all these other brain chemical systems. So the shorter answer is we really don't know how antidepressants, how their chemical effects translate into the experiences of emotional numbing or sexual dysfunction, or the other things that they cause. Some of them cause feelings of lethargy and demotivation. Some of them are, some antidepressants, not the SSRIs, but some antidepressants have more clear-cut sort of sedative effects. A common antidepressant that's used nowadays is called mirtazapine, and that that is sedative in the sense that it sends you off to sleep.
Yeah, it controls symptoms rather than cure anything.
So if you're having bad, real problems with sleeping, it might help to improve your sleep. As I say, the SSRIs can make people feel a bit lethargic and a bit groggy, but they don't send people to sleep like a benzodiazepine like Valium would do, or like mirtazapine and some of the older antidepressants. The tricyclic antidepressants also had clear-cut sedative effects and were often prescribed to people for insomnia.
Yes, but doesn't that mean that psychiatry mistakes sedation for recovery?
So as I say, not all antidepressants have these clear-cut sedative effects. Some of them seem to have this, like the SSRIs seem to have this numbing effect, make people a bit lethargic, but they don't just send people to sleep or knock people out like a more standard sedative substance. But I would agree with you to the extent that if what we are interpreting as improvement is sedation or emotional numbing, then we're not really looking at real improvement. We're looking at the control of some experiences that might be difficult for people. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. It's people, I think, can make, a sensible decision that, maybe my feelings are just too much to endure for the time being and I need to damp them down. As long as they are making those decisions in an informed way, as long as they understand the consequences of taking that drug, especially if they end up taking it in the over a long period of time,